Unit 10, Lesson 4, Jamestown and the Powhatan. Words to know are amend, to change or add to, anxiously, acting nervous or worried, consequently, therefore, happening as a result of something else, and devoured, which means completely destroyed. So we're in the student reader on page 32. John Smith talking to the colonists. Captain John Smith was hardworking and organized. Many historians believe that without him, Jamestown would not have survived. When John Smith finally took charge of the settlement, he did not beat around the bush. Smith introduced a very direct rule: only those who worked would eat. As you can imagine, Smith was not very popular with everyone, especially the wealthy young adventurers who had never worked a day in their lives. John Smith knew it would be a huge challenge for the settlers to survive the cold winter months. As the weeks went by, Smith urged everyone to work on the construction of Jamestown, to gather fruits and berries, to fish and hunt, and to use sparingly or very carefully the little food they had stored. John Smith among the Powhatan, page 33 through 35. There are several different accounts of what happened during this time. One well-known version of the story, which you may have heard, tells how when the cold winter months came, many of John Smith's fellow settlers were sick and starving to death. John Smith set off to hunt and to persuade the Powhatan to give them food. Okay. According to this account, which some might call a legend, Smith was captured by Powhatan warriors and taken to their chief, because they wanted to kill the man who was leading the foreigners. Then, as the story goes, just moments away from Smith's death, the chief's young daughter, Pocahontas, or Matoaka, begged her father to spare Smith. The chief agreed to his daughter's request, and Smith was released. Many historians today believe that this may be a romanticized version of what happened. They believe that Powhatan did not actually intend to kill John Smith. Instead, he wanted to adopt Smith into the Powhatan tribe. This common ritual in many Native American cultures involves the figurative killing of a person's identity in order to be reborn into a new identity. So those historians believe the Powhatan was going to figuratively kill John Smith's English identity so he could become a Powhatan. When Smith returned to the Jamestown settlement, the colonists had abandoned their work schedule. They were squabbling or arguing among themselves again. Snow was on the ground and their food supply was very low. Some were even spending their time foolishly searching for gold. Smith was not pleased. He immediately set to work hunting and fishing and doing what he could to persuade his cold, hungry, disheartened companions that all was not lost. Pages 35 to 36, Pocahontas bringing food to colonists. Then, one day, a small band of Powhatan, led by Pocahontas, appeared out of the forest. Having taken pity on this bunch of disorganized foreigners, the Powhatan brought with them much-needed food. Pocahontas and members of the Powhatan tribe returned many times with food and general aid or help. They also taught the English new hunting and farming techniques. The food the Powhatan provided was enough to keep the English alive until help from their homeland arrived. That help came in January 1608 when Captain Newport's ship, the Susan Constant, arrived laden with food and more than 100 new settlers. Needless to say, the Powhatan were not happy to see even more strangers coming to live on the land they inhabited. Jamestown on fire, page 37 through 38. For a while, the situation for Smith and his men improved. With more food to eat, they had energy to work. With more men, they had more hands to help construct the much-needed homes. Then tragedy struck, somehow, and it is not certain how. A fire broke out. The fierce flames quickly devoured many of the buildings, as well as some of the food supply and clothes. You can imagine how devastating or upsetting this was for the settlers. The English had no choice but to start again. Fortunately, by this time, the weather was getting warmer. The Powhatan had taught them how to grow corn, which they called maize. Now that the weather was better, the Native Americans helped once again by supplying the English with more food. Under John Smith's supervision, the men set to work rebuilding their homes, planting corn, and learning how to live in this new land. When spring came, Captain Newport set sail again for England. Some historians have written that the colonists who had been wasting their time searching for gold persuaded Captain Newport to load his ship with a large amount of red-colored dirt and bring it with him. The gold-hungry colonists were certain that tiny pieces of gold would be found once the dirt was properly examined in England. However, no gold was found. It seems that Captain Newport transported nothing more than a shipload of dirt across the Atlantic Ocean. Pages 38 through 41. New settler arrives with the first woman. Captain Newport returned to Jamestown again in the fall. The English colonists were happy to see him again. This time, Newport brought more supplies, as well as 72 men and 2 women. Yes, 2 women. One woman, Mrs. Thomas Forrest, was the wife of one of the men on board, and the other was her maid, Anne Burris. They were the first 2 women to live in Jamestown. Some of the other new settlers were from Poland and Germany, and they brought the skill of glassmaking to the country and colony. By this time, John Smith had been elected president of the colony, and he had consistently enforced his rule: all must work if they wanted to eat. In fact, these are Captain John Smith's exact words: "He that gathereth not every day as much as I do, the next day shall be set beyond the river, and be banished from the fort as a drone, till he amend his conditions or starve." Under John Smith's leadership, the colony began to prosper. Smith continued to establish fairly good relations with the Powhatan Indians. The 2 communities even began to trade with each other. The settlers traded beads and copper for food. However, 2 years after Jamestown was established, John Smith was injured in a gunpowder explosion. Without medical assistance, his wounds would not heal. Smith was forced to return to England. The man chosen to lead the colony in Smith's absence was George Percy. Unfortunately, Percy was not as good as a leader as Smith had been. However, to be fair, he did have a challenge on his hands from the moment he arrived. After Smith left, the Powhatans seemed to have a change of heart with regard to their new neighbors. Without John Smith there to actively promote friendship and trade between the Native Americans and the colonists, relations began to suffer. The Powhatan no longer had someone they felt they could trust within the colony, and they became wary of the colonists. They began to raid Jamestown and steal essential supplies, especially food. They fought with the English settlers, killing some of them. In addition, the English settlers, without John Smith there to enforce his rules, did not manage their food supplies as carefully as they should have. Then, once again, part of the settlement caught fire. Great distress in Jamestown, page 41 through 42. This time, the Powhatan refused to help the English settlers. The settlers waited anxiously for a ship that was due to arrive with supplies, but no ship appeared on the horizon. The winter of 1609 to 1610 became known as the starving time because colonists ran out of food and many of them died. Finally, one spring day, 2 ships were spotted. They were the Patience and the Deliverance. The settlers who had survived ran to the banks of the James River in eager anticipation. Both ships had been badly damaged at sea and had just barely made it to Virginia. The ships were low on supplies. The settlers begged to be taken back to England, and the 2 captains agreed. Perhaps the most incredible part of this story is what happened next. Just as the surviving settlers had turned their back on Jamestown and set sail for England, they spotted an advance party of Englishmen sailing toward them. The retreating settlers were immediately informed that Lord de la Warr was close behind. Lord de la Warr was appointed by King James to serve as governor or leader of Jamestown. Lord de la Warr, it seems, had saved the day, well, the entire settlement actually. He had led 3 ships across the Atlantic filled to the brim with Englishmen and supplies destined for Jamestown. Page 42 through 43. Lord de la Warr takes charge. The Powhatan must have been horrified to see the settlers return. Even worse, there were more of them. Fortunately for the settlers, Lord de la Warr turned out to be a good leader. He restored a sense of order in Jamestown. Under his leadership, the buildings were repaired and the food and supplies were efficiently managed. However, Lord de la Warr did not reach out to the Powhatan as John Smith had. Things in England were changing, and the instructions to Jamestown from the Virginia Company of London were to stop trading with and relying upon the nearby Native Americans. Over the next several years, more and more skilled settlers made their way to Virginia. Eventually, in 1619, the first shipload of women arrived. colonists began to raise families in this English colony. Although gold was not discovered, something just as valuable was. In time, a settler named John Rolfe began to establish a relationship with the Powhatan once again. Guided by the Powhatan and under the supervision of John Rolfe, the settlers began to grow tobacco. Page 44, House of Burgesses Assembly. There were other important developments that took place in 1619. Now that things were going quite well in the English colonies, the English government felt comfortable allowing the colonists to make certain rules of their own. That was, as long as the colonists remembered who was really in charge. On July 30th, 1619, the first lawmaking assembly gathered in the Virginia House of Burgesses. Members of the House of Burgesses was chosen to represent areas of the colony of Virginia. Of course, only men could be chosen, but the House of Burgesses would eventually pave the way for self-government and, ultimately, independence. John Rolfe and Pocahontas meet King James, page 44 through 45. It was during another period of conflict between the Powhatan and the settlers that the Powhatan kidnapped some of the settlers and took several firearms or guns in response. The settlers kidnapped Pocahontas. Pocahontas' father was willing to return the kidnapped settlers in exchange for his daughter, but not the firearms. In response, the settlers refused to let Pocahontas go. Consequently, or as a result, Pocahontas spent quite a bit of time in the English settlement, several years in fact. During this time, Pocahontas and John Rolfe were married and had a son named Thomas. During this time, Pocahontas converted to Christianity and took the name Rebecca. She and John Rolfe traveled together to England, where they were guests at the court of King James. Sadly, just as Pocahontas and John Rolfe were preparing to return to Virginia, she became very ill. Pocahontas died on March 21, 1617, at the age of 22, and was buried in England. Later, in the last years of his life, John Smith spoke of Pocahontas and said that without her help and the help of the Powhatan, Jamestown would never have survived. Perhaps this colony was given the wrong name. What do you think?